I never told my in-laws I was a judge. My mother-in-law laughed when I walked into court alone. She told her overpriced lawyer I was finished, that I was a broke government worker who could not afford representation, but when the chief prosecutor walked in, stopped dead and said, "Good morning, Your Honor." The smug smile vanished from her face. She stammered and asked who I was. "My name is Simone. I am 38 years old, and somehow I am still healing from wounds my family inflicted. For years I played the quiet wife while they treated me like dirt. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The nightmare began on a rainy Sunday evening. My mother-in-law Vivian hosted her lavish dinners every week. These were calculated displays of wealth and status. Vivian was 62 and prided herself on being part of the old money elite. Her sprawling brick estate, the family legacy, was filled with imported mahogany and crystal chandeliers. When my husband Derek and I arrived, the house smelled of roasted lamb and heavy perfume. I took off my coat, a tailored wool piece I had saved months to buy. It was classic and the only expensive item I owned. I draped it over an antique dining chair. I wanted to get through dinner without an incident. My sister-in-law Kendra walked into the room carrying her designer toy poodle. Kendra was 34, the golden child, a woman who never worked a hard day. She wore a silk dress that cost more than my first car. Without looking at me, Kendra walked over, grabbed the collar of my wool coat, and tossed it onto the hardwood floor. I watched in stunned silence as my coat crumpled. Kendra gently placed her dog onto the velvet cushion. She turned to me completely unapologetic and smiled a cold smile. "The dog needs a place to sit, Simone," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You do not mind, do you? You can brush the dust off your jacket later. It is not like it is anything special." My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at my husband Derek. He stood near the fireplace swirling a glass of bourbon. He saw his sister throw my belongings on the floor for a dog. But Derek just looked away and took a sip of his drink. He never defended me. He was 40 years old, the owner of a mid-sized car dealership, yet terrified of upsetting his mother and sister. He always told me to keep the peace. I did not yell. I did not scream. I calmly walked to the corner, picked up my coat, brushed off the dust, and folded it over my arm. I took my seat at the far end of the long dining table, right where Vivian always placed me, as far away from the center of attention as possible. Dinner was agonizing. The conversation revolved around country club gossip, luxury vacations, and Kendra complaining about her husband Terrence and his real estate schedule. I ate in silence, hoping the evening would end quickly. As the dessert plates were cleared away, Vivian stood up at the head of the table. She tapped her crystal wine glass with a silver spoon, demanding attention. She reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer and pulled out a thick envelope. She walked over to my end of the table and slammed the envelope down, right next to my coffee cup. The loud smack made me flinch. "What is this?" I asked quietly, looking up at her harsh eyes. Vivian sneered down at me. "That is the new property tax and renovation bill for the family estate," she declared loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "The roof needs fixing, the plumbing needs updating, and the county just raised the taxes. It comes out to exactly $25,000. And since you eat my food, sit in my house, and enjoy the prestige of being associated with this family, I expect you to pay it." I stared at the thick white envelope, bewildered. $25,000. "Vivian, Derek, and I have our own mortgage to worry about," I said. "We have our own bills. Why are you asking me to pay for renovations on your house?" Vivian laughed. "Let us be honest here, Simone. You work a low-level government desk job. Derek is running a business building wealth. The least you can do with your civil service paycheck is contribute to the legacy. You are practically living off my son. It is time you earned your keep." Kendra giggled from across the table. "Yeah, Simone. It is the least you can do. You are lucky we even let you sit at the table. Pity goes a long way." The disrespect was suffocating. They thought I was just a lowly public defender scraping by on government wages. For 10 grueling years, I had worked in the trenches of the legal system. I fought for people who had nothing. I worked 80-hour weeks. It was exhausting work, but I was brilliant at it. My mind was sharp, my arguments were flawless, and I had earned the respect of every major legal figure in the state. What even my husband Derek did not know was that 3 weeks ago, my life had completely changed. The governor of the state had personally called me into his office. 3 weeks ago, I was secretly appointed as a district court judge. I was the person holding the gavel. I was the one who made the final decisions. I kept my new appointment a secret from the family for one specific reason. Derek. My husband was incredibly insecure. I knew that if I came home and announced that I was now one of the most powerful legal figures in the district, his fragile ego would shatter. I was waiting for the right moment to tell him. But sitting at that table, looking at the sheer contempt in his mother's eyes and his absolute refusal to defend me, I realized my kindness had been a waste of time. I looked at the envelope resting on the tablecloth. Vivian was supposedly swimming in old money, yet she was trying to extort her daughter-in-law for roof repairs. Vivian was obsessed with appearances, and asking me for money meant she was desperate. I did not argue. I did not throw a tantrum. A good judge never reacts emotionally to an accusation. A good judge gathers the facts, reviews the evidence, and waits for the perfect moment to deliver the verdict. "Fine," I said softly. "I will look at the bill." Vivian smirked, clearly satisfied with what she thought was my total submission. "Good. I expect the funds transferred by Friday. Do not make me ask twice." She turned her back to me and walked back to her seat, resuming her conversation with Kendra, as if I had ceased to exist. Derek finally looked at me from across the room. He gave me a weak, pathetic nod, as if to say thank you for not causing a scene. My own husband was relieved that I was willing to be financially drained just to keep his mother comfortable. The betrayal stung, but the pain was replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I reached out and pulled the envelope toward me. I opened the flap and pulled out the stack of papers. The first page was the property tax assessment from the county. I scanned the document, my trained eyes easily moving past the legal jargon and the bureaucratic formatting. I looked at the property address, verifying it was indeed the sprawling estate we were currently sitting in. Then, my eyes moved down to the section labeled Current Registered Owner. I froze. I read the name once, blinked, and read it again. The letters seemed to jump off the page, confirming a reality that changed everything in an instant. The name on the property title was not Vivian's. It was not the family trust. It was a name I recognized instantly, a name that unraveled a massive web of lies right there at the dinner table. Vivian did not own this house anymore, and if Vivian did not own the house, she had absolutely no legal right to ask for a single dime in renovations. I slid the paper back into the envelope, a slow, dangerous smile creeping onto my face as I realized the trap they had just walked right into. I carefully folded the assessment paper back into the crisp white envelope and tucked it inside my leather purse. The dining room was still buzzing with the hollow laughter of people who believed they were untouchable. I stood up from my chair, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Vivian paused her conversation and glared at me. "Leaving so soon, Simone?" she asked, her tone laced with fake concern. "We have not even served the espresso." I offered a tight, polite smile. "I have an early morning at the office," I replied smoothly. "Thank you for the lovely dinner, Vivian. I will be in touch regarding this invoice." I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room toward the grand foyer. My footsteps echoed in the high-ceilinged hallway. I heard the heavy oak door of the dining room swing open and shut. Derek was following me. I stopped near the front door, slipping my arms into my wool coat. Derek grabbed my elbow, his grip tighter than usual. His face was flushed, whether from the bourbon or embarrassment I could not tell. "What are you doing?" he hissed, glancing back over his shoulder to make sure his mother could not hear him. "You cannot just walk out while she is talking to you. You are making me look bad." I pulled my arm out of his grasp. "I am making you look bad," I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously low. "Your mother just handed me a $25,000 bill for a house that is not even in her name, Derek. And you stood there and watched her humiliate me." Derek rolled his eyes and let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. You are always so dramatic, Simone. It is just money. We can pull it from our joint savings. I stared at the man I had married. He looked weak, standing in the shadow of his mother's oppressive wealth. Just money, I echoed. It is $25,000 for a property tax bill on a house she does not legally own. I read the assessment, Derek. Who is really behind this? Who is the registered owner? Derek crossed his arms and shifted his weight defensively. He refused to meet my eyes. You do not understand how these things work, he muttered. It is complicated. It is business. Terrence is handling it. Terrence? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Your brother-in-law who flips cheap properties and drives leased sports cars he can barely afford. Do not talk about Terrence like that. Derek snapped, his voice rising a fraction. Terrence actually has vision. He is putting together a massive deal. He is buying this entire estate from my mother. They are going to knock down this old house and develop luxury townhomes on the land. It is a multi-million-dollar project, Simone. We are keeping it in the family. He is going to give me a cut of the profits for helping facilitate the transition. I felt a cold laugh bubbling in my chest, but I kept my face entirely neutral. And what exactly does facilitating the transition mean? I asked calmly. Derek puffed out his chest, trying to sound like a seasoned executive. Mom is stressed about the cash flow right now. The taxes and the roof repairs are causing her anxiety before the sale goes through. Terrence is tying up his capital in the zoning permits. He told me that if we just cover this $25,000 to grease the wheels and keep Mom happy, it will ensure the deal goes smoothly. Think of it as an investment, Simone. A small price to pay for family loyalty and a massive return later. I stood frozen in the foyer, the magnitude of their delusion washing over me. They were planning a multi-million-dollar real estate development. Terrence was acting as the mastermind, Vivian was playing the eager seller, and Derek was playing the loyal son, footing the immediate bills. They were entirely convinced of their brilliant scheme. But there was one massive, insurmountable problem with their grand plan. A problem that made my blood run cold with a mixture of disbelief and utter satisfaction. They could not knock down this house. They could not sell this land, because Vivian did not own it, and neither did Terrence. 5 years ago, Vivian's obsession with maintaining her wealthy facade had caught up with her. She had quietly taken out massive secondary loans against the family estate to fund her luxury trips, her designer wardrobe, and her country club fees. She had gambled away the family legacy. The bank had sent a final notice of foreclosure. Vivian was going to lose the house, the land, and her precious social standing. Derek had been a wreck, crying in our living room about how his mother would not survive the humiliation of being evicted from the historic family home. I had loved Derek back then. I had loved him enough to do something incredibly foolish but legally bulletproof. Using the money I had inherited from my own frugal, hard-working parents, along with every cent of my savings, I approached the bank through a private holding company. I formed a blind limited liability company. I paid off the suffocating debt and quietly purchased the deed to the property. I allowed Vivian to continue living there rent-free, paying the property taxes silently through the LLC, just to spare my husband the pain of seeing his mother destitute. I never told Derek. I knew his pride could not handle the fact that his public defender wife had bailed out his supposedly aristocratic family. I let them keep their pride. I let them keep their illusion of wealth, and this was how they repaid me. By plotting to sell the house I legally owned behind my back and trying to extort me for $25,000 to grease the wheels of their own fraudulent transaction. Terrence had clearly found some shady way to manipulate the county tax records or forge a preliminary agreement, but he had absolutely no idea who actually held the ironclad deed to the land beneath his feet. He was planning to build luxury townhomes on my dirt. Simone, are you even listening to me? Derek demanded, snapping his fingers in front of my face. I need you to transfer the money by Wednesday. Terrence has contractors coming to look at the roof on Thursday. I blinked, pulling myself out of the past and focusing sharply on my husband. The man I had protected for 5 years was now actively participating in my financial exploitation. I looked at him feeling absolutely nothing. No love, no pity, only the cold, precise logic of a judge evaluating a guilty defendant. "I am not paying it, Derek," I said softly. My voice was steady, lacking any trace of the hysteria he expected. "I am not giving your mother $25,000. I am not greasing any wheels for Terrence. Not today, not Wednesday, not ever." Derek stepped closer, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "You are so selfish," he spat. "You have always been selfish. You sit in your little cubicle down at the courthouse acting like you are better than us because you read a few law books. You have no idea how the real world works. You do not understand big business, Simone." I tilted my head, studying him as if he were a stranger. "I understand fraud, Derek," I replied evenly. "I understand that asking someone to pay taxes on a property they do not own is a profound legal mistake. You are going to pay it," Derek said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You are going to pay it? Or I swear to God, Simone, I will make you regret it. You do not know who you are messing with. Terrence is not some low-level street thug. He has serious connections in this city. He knows people on the city council. He knows people in the banking sector. If you try to embarrass my family or ruin this deal, Terrence will crush you. He will ruin whatever pathetic little career you think you have." I felt a genuine smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. A judge. He was threatening to have a sleazy real estate broker ruin the career of a sitting district court judge. The absolute comedy of the situation was almost intoxicating. "Are you threatening me, Derek?" I asked, making sure to articulate every single syllable, because I need to be perfectly clear on what is happening right now. "Are you telling me that if I do not hand over my money for this phantom real estate deal, your brother-in-law is going to destroy my career?" "It is not a threat. It is a promise," Derek snarled, stepping back and pointing a finger at my chest. "Terrence plays in the big leagues. You are just a government employee drawing a salary. You have no power, you have no connections, you have nothing but the ring on your finger, and you are about to lose that if you do not fall in line. Go home, Simone. Transfer the money. Do not make me choose between you and my family, because you will lose." He turned around and walked back toward the dining room, leaving me standing alone in the grand foyer of the house I secretly owned. He thought he had put me in my place. He thought he had terrified me into submission. He believed I was just a weak, powerless woman who would dutifully empty her bank account to avoid his wrath. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the damp night air. The rain had started to fall, slicking the cobblestone driveway and washing over my expensive wool coat. I walked to my car, my mind already working 10 steps ahead. Derek was right about one thing. Terrence was playing a dangerous game. But Derek was entirely wrong about the players. They thought I was a pawn on their board. They had no idea they had just declared war on the person who owned the board, wrote the rules, and held the gavel. I slid into the driver's seat of my sedan, started the engine, and pulled out of the gates of the estate. I did not drive toward the house I shared with Derek. I drove downtown. I needed to get to my chambers. It was time to start drafting some subpoenas. The wheels of justice were about to start turning, and they were going to crush Terrence Vivian and my treacherous husband into absolute dust. I reached for my phone on the dashboard and dialed a secure number. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "This is Judge Simone," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet cabin of the car. "I need to request an emergency review of some commercial real estate filings first thing tomorrow morning. Yes, it involves a potential multi-million-dollar fraud case. I will have the preliminary evidence ready by sunrise." I hung up the phone and merged onto the highway. Derek thought he had given me an ultimatum. He thought I was driving home in defeat. But the truth was far more destructive. I was not going home to transfer money. I was going to war, and I was going to strip them of everything they claimed to own. They wanted to play high-stakes real estate. I was going to show them exactly what happens when you try to sell a house that belongs to the judge presiding over your inevitable criminal trial. The game had just begun. By Tuesday evening, the trap was fully set. I had spent my Monday morning in chambers signing off on a series of silent, devastating subpoenas aimed directly at Terrence and his shell companies. My clerks had pulled his banking records, his corporate filings, and the digital footprint of his so-called real estate empire. What they found was a financial bloodbath. Terrence was not a mastermind. He was a desperate man drowning in debt. Now I just had to wait for him to make his next move. I did not have to wait long. I was standing at my kitchen island pouring a cup of chamomile tea when the front door swung open with a violent thud. Derek had not even bothered to warn me. In walked my mother-in-law Vivian, clutching a designer handbag like a shield. She wore a smug expression, looking around my home as if she already owned it. Following closely behind her was Terrence. He was dressed in his signature look, a slick, tightly tailored suit that screamed new money, an oversized gold watch, and expensive loafers without socks. He looked every bit the arrogant Atlanta real estate bro he pretended to be. Derek trailed behind them, looking down at his shoes entirely useless. "What is the meaning of this?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. I did not raise my hands, I simply set my teapot down on the marble counter. Terrence did not waste time with pleasantries. He swaggered over to the kitchen island, pulling a thick document from his leather portfolio. He slapped it down onto the marble surface with a loud smack. "We are done playing games," Simone Terrence announced, leaning over the counter to invade my personal space. "You had your chance to do this the easy way and just pay the $25,000. But since you want to be difficult, we are moving to Plan B." I glanced down at this document. The bold letters at the top read, "Quitclaim deed and marital interest relinquishment." "What exactly is this?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "It is your exit ticket," Vivian snapped from the doorway, crossing her arms over her chest. "It is a legal document severing you from this family and its assets. Since you refuse to contribute, you will no longer have any claim to the family estate. You are signing away any marital rights to the property." "And my dealership," Derek chimed in weakly from the background. "You have to sign away any spousal rights to the car dealership too." Terrence said it is the only way to protect the family business from your financial instability. My financial instability. I almost laughed out loud. I looked at Terrence, who was tapping a thick gold pen against the marble countertop. "Sign the paper," Simone Terrence commanded, his voice dropping into what he probably thought was an intimidating register. "You relinquish your marital rights to the family estate and Derek's dealership. You walk away with your little government pension and we do not crush you. If you refuse, I will personally make sure your life is a living hell. I have lawyers who will drag you through civil court for the next decade. I will sue you for the renovation costs, the delayed project fees, and emotional distress to my mother-in-law. I will have your pathetic state wages garnished before you even see a dime of your paycheck. You will be living on the street." I did not flinch. I did not back away. Instead, I slowly reached out and pulled the document toward me. I looked down at the pages, and my trained legal eye immediately began dissecting the absolute garbage Terrence had placed in front of me. It was a disaster. Terrence had clearly downloaded a generic template from the internet and hastily filled in the blanks. There were glaring jurisdictional errors. He had cited the wrong county codes for property transfer. The liability waiver clause was entirely unenforceable under state marital property laws. Furthermore, he had neglected to include a standard notary block required for a quitclaim deed to even be legally recognized. The document was completely worthless. It was not worth the paper it was printed on. But what fascinated me more than the legal incompetence was the sheer desperation radiating from the pages. Why the sudden rush? Why ambush me on a Tuesday night with a sloppy, legally binding document that looked like it was drafted in a panic? I knew the answer because I had read his subpoenaed bank records that morning. Terrence was completely broke. His flashy lifestyle was a house of cards built on massive, high-interest loans. A year ago, Terrence had decided he was a financial genius and heavily leveraged his assets into a series of highly volatile cryptocurrency investments. When the crypto market crashed, his portfolio was wiped out entirely. But he had not used a standard bank for those investments. He had borrowed money from unregulated private lenders, men who did not care about credit scores, men who only cared about getting their cash back with exorbitant interest. The loan sharks were circling him. Terrence needed liquid cash, and he needed it yesterday. His grand plan was to force a fraudulent sale of the family estate to one of his shell companies, use the property as collateral to secure a massive commercial loan, and pay off his dangerous creditors before they broke his legs. The $25,000 he tried to extort from me was likely meant to cover an immediate interest payment to buy him a few more days. If he did not deliver that cash by the end of the week, his luxurious lifestyle would not be the only thing facing sudden termination. The panic practically radiated from his pores, betraying his confident facade. He was standing in my kitchen trying to project power, but all I saw was a terrified boy cornered by his own catastrophic stupidity. "You look nervous, Terrence," I observed quietly, looking up from the document. "You are sweating through your expensive suit. Is there a deadline you are trying to meet?" Terrence's jaw clenched. "Do not try to psychoanalyze me, you low-level desk jockey. Just sign the damn paper." Vivian stepped forward, her face twisting in anger. "How dare you speak to him that way? Terrence is trying to save this family from your toxic influence. He is bringing us millions. You bring nothing but disrespect. Sign the document, Simone. You are holding up progress." I looked at Derek. He was staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with me. My husband was standing in our kitchen, actively helping a desperate fraudster steal my assets. He was too blinded by his mother's approval to see that Terrence was leading them all straight into a federal prison cell. "If I sign this," I said slowly, playing along with their delusion, "you promise to leave me alone. You promise not to garnish my wages." Terrence smirked mistakenly, believing he had won. "We will drop the lawsuit. We will let you walk away with whatever pathetic savings you have. Consider it an act of charity from the family. Just sign the bottom line, Simone, and this all goes away." He pushed the gold pen across the marble island toward me. It rolled smoothly and stopped right against the edge of the paper. The room fell entirely silent. Vivian was watching me with a look of supreme victory. Derek looked relieved that the conflict was ending. Terrence was practically vibrating with desperate anticipation, his eyes locked on the pen. I looked at the pen. I looked at the sloppy, fraudulent document. And then I looked at the three people who had spent years treating me like a second-class citizen. They thought they had backed a helpless public defender into a corner. They thought fear and intimidation would force my hand. I picked up the heavy gold pen. I felt the cool metal against my fingers. Terrence let out a breath he had been holding. Vivian smiled coldly. I brought the pen down to the paper, but I did not sign my name. Instead, I gripped the thick stack of paper with my left hand and the top edge with my right. With a swift, fluid motion, I ripped the entire document in half. The sound of tearing paper was deafening in the quiet kitchen. Terrence gasped, stepping back as if I had struck him. Vivian let out a shriek of outrage. Derek finally looked up, his eyes wide with shock. Before any of them could speak, I turned to my right, where my heavy-duty cross-cut paper shredder sat neatly beneath my home office desk area. I walked over, pressed the power button, and fed the torn halves directly into the machine. The mechanical grinding sound roared to life, violently chewing Terrence's desperate, pathetic exit strategy into thousands of tiny, unreadable confetti strips. I watched the paper disappear, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice cutting through their stunned silence like a scalpel. "You do not have the power to garnish my wages. You do not have the power to sue me for a house you do not own. And you certainly do not have the power to intimidate me in my own kitchen. Get out of my house," I repeated, staring directly into Terrence's fearful, wide-open eyes. Vivian stared at the shredder, her mouth hanging open in pure disbelief. The document they had banked their hopes on was now paper dust at the bottom of a plastic bin. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, thick with the realization that their intimidation tactics had failed. Then the shock on Vivian's face morphed into something terrifying. It was not just anger. It was the feral, unhinged desperation of an arrogant woman who had just lost control for the first time in her life. She realized her grand plan to force my signature was dead. Vivian's eyes darted frantically around the kitchen, looking for anything she could use to regain control. Her gaze landed on a heavy crystal vase sitting on the dining table. Without a word, Vivian marched over to the table. She grabbed the vase with both hands, lifted it high above her head, and hurled it violently onto the hardwood floor. The crash was deafening. Thick shards of crystal exploded and water splashed across the wood. What are you doing? Derek yelled, finally snapping out of his dazed silence. Mom, stop it! But Vivian did not stop. She dropped to her knees right in the middle of the broken glass. She reached up and dug her manicured fingernails into her own cheeks. With a vicious swipe, she dragged her nails across her skin, leaving bleeding scratches down both sides of her face. She tore at the collar of her silk blouse, ripping the fabric, and began violently scratching her own arms until red welts appeared. It was a grotesque display of self-mutilation performed with calculation. Then, she opened her mouth and began to scream. It was a piercing, blood-curdling shriek that echoed off the high ceilings of our home. "Help me," she wailed, throwing herself backward onto the floor. "Derek, help me. She is crazy. She attacked me. Keep her away from me." Terrence caught on to the performance instantly. The fear in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dark, opportunistic gleam. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and dialed 911. He pressed the phone to his ear, his voice pitched high in fabricated panic. "Yes, I need police and an ambulance immediately," Terrence shouted into the phone, pointing a finger directly at me. "My sister-in-law just went insane. She attacked my elderly mother-in-law. There is blood everywhere." She threw a vase at her. "Please hurry. She is completely out of control." I stood rooted to the spot, watching the chaotic theater unfold. I did not move. A younger version of me might have panicked. I might have tried to explain to Derek that I had not touched her. But the woman standing in that kitchen was a judge who spent her days analyzing criminal behavior. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were creating a crime scene to manufacture a domestic assault charge. They wanted me arrested and removed from the house so they could maintain leverage. Derek rushed past me, completely ignoring my existence. He dropped to his knees beside his mother, his face pale with panic, examining the bleeding scratches on her face. Vivian sobbed hysterically, clutching Derek's shirt. "She tried to kill me!" "Derek," Vivian cried, her voice trembling with artificial trauma. "I just asked her to help the family," and she snapped. She grabbed me. Derek looked up at me from the floor. I expected him to seek my side of the story, to remember the woman he had lived with for years. I had never raised a hand to anyone, but there was no question in his eyes. There was only pure, unadulterated hatred. The illusion of our marriage shattered completely in that exact second. Derek was not my partner. He was never my partner. He was merely a puppet, forever bound by the strings his mother pulled. He needed a villain so his mother could remain the victim, and he assigned me the role without a moment of hesitation. "Get out," Derek said, his voice shaking. "Get out of my house right now." "She did that to herself," I said evenly. "Terrence is lying." "Shut up," Derek roared. "Do not say another word. You are sick. You attacked my mother in my own home. I want you out before the police get here. If you are still in this house when those sirens arrive, I will personally press charges. Pack your things and get out." The devastating realization settled over me like a heavy winter coat. 10 years of marriage. 10 years of compromises, of hiding my success, of secretly paying off his mother's debts. It all amounted to nothing. He was willing to throw me to the wolves based on a theatrical performance that belonged in a cheap soap opera. I did not beg. I did not cry. I simply turned away from the pathetic scene in the kitchen and walked up the staircase to the master bedroom. I did not take a suitcase. I did not pack my clothes. I did not need any of the material possessions in this house. Everything of real value to me was stored in the secure servers of the judicial system and the locked drawers of my chambers. I walked into my home office, which adjoined the bedroom. I reached under the desk and pulled out my single leather briefcase. I placed my laptop inside. I opened the bottom drawer and retrieved an encrypted external hard drive containing backups of the financial records I subpoenaed earlier today. I dropped it into the briefcase and snapped the locks shut. That was all I needed. I was not leaving as a defeated wife. I was leaving as a federal officer securing the evidence of a felony crime scene. I walked back down the stairs, the heavy leather briefcase gripped firmly in my hand. The kitchen was still a stage of manufactured chaos. Vivian was holding a dish towel to her cheek, whimpering softly. Terrence was standing by the front window waiting for the police to arrive. Derek was sweeping up the large shards of crystal, playing the role of the dutiful protective son. They all stopped and looked at me as I reached the bottom of the stairs. They expected tears or frantic pleas for mercy. Instead, they saw a woman in a tailored suit holding a briefcase looking at them with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an insect. "You are going to regret this for the rest of your life," Derek spat, leaning on the broom handle. "You are nothing without this family. You are going to lose everything." I did not answer him. I walked past him, stepping carefully around the puddle of water. I opened the heavy front door. The rain was falling harder now, a steady downpour that washed over the paved driveway. The cold air rushed into the warm house. I stepped out onto the covered porch. Before pulling the door shut behind me, I paused and looked back over my shoulder. Vivian lowered the dish towel from her face. The sobbing had miraculously stopped. She looked at me standing in the cold night air. A slow, triumphant smirk spread across her face, pulling at the fresh scratches on her cheeks. She thought she had won. She thought her violent little performance had successfully eliminated the only obstacle in her path. I looked at Vivian's smug, bleeding face. I looked at Terrence's arrogant posture. I looked at my husband, blind to the prison sentence hanging over him. I felt a surge of profound, cold satisfaction. I let a genuine smile break across my face, making Vivian's smirk falter. "See you in court," I whispered. I pulled the door shut. I walked out into the pouring rain, the cold drops soaking into my clothes. I did not ever run away. I walked with a steady, measured pace, the leather briefcase heavy and secure in my grip. In the distance, over the sound of the falling rain, I could hear the faint, rising wail of police sirens approaching the neighborhood. Let them come. Let them take the statements. Let Vivian file her false reports, and Terrence spin his desperate lies. Every word they told the police tonight was just another nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. I started my car and pulled out of the driveway just as the flashing red and blue lights turned onto the street. I drove past the police cruisers, completely invisible to them in the dark downpour. They were rushing to a crime scene to investigate a domestic assault, completely unaware that the real crime was massive financial fraud, and the prime witness had just driven right past them. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the arrogance of my in-laws had just given me everything I needed to destroy them entirely. The battle in the house was over, but the war in the courtroom was just beginning. I checked into a quiet, upscale hotel downtown under my maiden name. The rain battered against the heavy glass windows of my suite all night, but I slept with a deep, dreamless peace. I woke up at exactly 5 in the morning. My phone was sitting on the nightstand face down. When I flipped it over, the screen was a blinding cascade of notifications, hundreds of them, missed calls, text messages, direct messages, and tags across every social media platform. Kendra had been busy while I was sleeping. Atlanta society, specifically the affluent African American circles Vivian and Kendra worshipped, operated on a strict currency of reputation. It was a world of exclusive country clubs, high-profile charity galas, legacy sororities, and historic church congregations. Your name was your brand, and a scandal could get you excommunicated faster than financial ruin. Kendra understood this ecosystem perfectly. Since she lacked actual talent or a meaningful career, she had spent her adult life mastering the art of digital gossip. She weaponized information. I unlocked my phone and tapped on the first notification. It was a post Kendra had made in the private Facebook group for the Oakwood Country Club, an exclusive organization Vivian had been a board member of for 20 years. The post was a masterclass in manipulation. Attached were 3 high-resolution photos of Vivian's face. The harsh lighting emphasized the deep, bloody scratches she had inflicted upon herself. The caption read, "Please pray for my mother." Last night, she was violently attacked in her own home by her daughter-in-law, Simone. We took her in when she had nothing. We treated her like family. And this is how she repays us. Please keep our family in your prayers as we navigate this domestic violence nightmare. The post already had hundreds of comments. I scrolled through them, watching people I had known for a decade tear my character to shreds. Women I had hosted for brunch, women I had donated money to for their various charities, were calling for my immediate arrest. They called me an animal. They called me a broke, ungrateful gold digger who had finally shown her true colors. They speculated wildly about my mental health. Kendra even added a follow-up comment claiming I had tried to steal cash from Vivian's purse before fleeing the scene into the night. It was an absolute circus of fabricated outrage. Kendra did not stop at the country club. She cross-posted the photos to the Women's Auxiliary Board of their historic megachurch. The church members were even more vicious, hiding their venom behind Bible verses and fake concern. I read a comment from Deaconess Martha, a woman whose son I had secretly counseled for free when he was facing a minor drug charge. Martha wrote, "We always knew Derek married beneath his station. The devil is truly busy in that girl. I am praying for swift justice against that violent woman." My phone buzzed in my hand with a new text message. It was from a woman named Chloe, someone I had considered a close friend since law school. Chloe wrote, "I just saw Kendra's Instagram story. Simone, how could you do that to an elderly woman? You need serious psychiatric help. Do not ever contact me again." I deleted her number without replying. The messages kept pouring in. Some were from distant relatives of Derek, demanding I return every dime I had ever spent of the family money. Some were from local Atlanta socialites who barely knew me, just eager to participate in the public execution of a woman they deemed unworthy of their elite ranks. They were trying to bury me under an avalanche of public shame. In their world, this was the ultimate weapon. If you destroy a person's reputation in Atlanta, you destroy their ability to function. You cannot get a loan, you cannot secure a business contract, and you certainly cannot show your face in polite society. They believed that by painting me as a violent, deranged gold digger, they were discrediting any future claims I might make about their financial fraud. They were creating a preemptive narrative. If I tried to tell anyone about the fake quit-claim deed or the money laundering, people would just dismiss it as the desperate lies of an abusive ex-wife trying to get revenge against the family that finally kicked her out. It was a brilliant strategy for a reality television show, but it was a catastrophic strategy for a federal court. I walked over to the hotel room window and looked out at the city skyline. The morning sun was just beginning to pierce through the heavy rain clouds, casting a golden glow over the towering skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta. Down there in those glass and steel buildings, the real power of the city resided. Not in the country clubs, not in the gossip circles, and not in the comment sections of Instagram. Real power lived in court orders, subpoenas, and federal indictments. I watched my phone light up again. It was Derek. He left a voicemail. I pressed play, listening to it through the phone's speaker. "Simone," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "You see what happens when you cross my family. Everyone knows what you did. You are a pariah in this city now. Mom is pressing charges today. The police are going to issue a warrant for your arrest. If you want to avoid going to county jail, you need to call Terrence's lawyer right now. Sign the papers. Agree to the uncontested divorce. And we will tell the police it was a misunderstanding caused by your mental breakdown. Do the right thing before your life is completely ruined." I deleted the voicemail. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt the profound, calm focus of a predator watching its prey wander blindly into a cage. They were so confident in their little social media campaign. They were so sure that public opinion would force me to surrender. They had no idea that while they were busy manipulating country club wives and church deacons, I had spent the night securing their financial execution. Every post Kendra made, every lie she typed, every defamatory comment she liked or replied to was just adding more counts of defamation and perjury to the massive mountain of evidence I was building against them. They were handing me the rope they would hang themselves with, and they were doing it on a public, digital forum where nothing could ever truly be deleted. I turned away from the window and walked into the luxurious bathroom. I took a long, hot shower, washing away the lingering scent of Vivian's house and the memory of Derek's pathetic weakness. I stepped out, dried off, and began to get ready for the day ahead. I did not put on the conservative, unassuming clothes I usually wore to blend into the background of Derek's life. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the single outfit I had brought with me. It was a sharply tailored, immaculate black suit. I paired it with a crisp white blouse and black leather heels. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style. I looked in the mirror. I did not look like a broke gold digger. I did not look like a frightened, abusive wife begging for mercy. I looked exactly like what I was, a judge. I checked my watch. It was 7:30 in the morning. The city was waking up and the federal and district buildings would be opening their doors soon. I picked up my phone from the nightstand. It was still vibrating with fresh waves of hate messages, tagged photos, and aggressive notifications from people who thought their opinions mattered. I did not read any more of them. I simply pressed the power button and shut the device down completely, plunging their toxic little world into absolute darkness. I slipped the dead phone into my pocket, grabbed my leather briefcase, and walked out of the hotel room without a second thought. The drive to the courthouse was short and uneventful. The morning traffic parted effortlessly as I navigated through the busy downtown streets. I pulled into the secure underground parking garage, reserved exclusively for high-ranking government officials and judicial staff. I rolled down my window and swiped my newly issued credentials against the electronic reader. The heavy metal gate swung open immediately, granting me access to a world Vivian and Terrence could never buy their way into. I parked my car in the spot clearly marked with my new title and stepped out into the cool, echoing concrete structure. I walked toward the private elevator that led directly to the secure judicial chambers. 2 armed security guards were standing at the entrance. They were large, intimidating men who spent their days dealing with the most dangerous elements of the city. As I approached, their posture immediately changed. They did not ask for my identification. They did not question why I was there. They simply stepped back, parted ways, and held the heavy glass doors open for me. "Good morning, Your Honor," the head guard said, his voice filled with absolute respect. "We have your chambers prepared and the prosecutor's office sent up the requested files." "Thank you, Marcus," I replied smoothly, stepping into the private elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing me inside the quiet oak-paneled carriage. As the elevator carried me up into the heart of the justice system, I allowed myself a small, fleeting smile. Let Kendra have her Facebook likes. Let Vivian have the sympathy of the country club. Today, I was going to teach them the devastating difference between social influence and absolute legal authority. The doors of the private elevator slid open with a soft chime, revealing the secure corridor of the judicial chambers. The air up here was cool and heavy with the silent weight of the law. I walked down the hallway, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor. I passed portraits of past judges who had built the foundation I stood upon. I stopped before a heavy oak door bearing a freshly engraved brass plaque. Judge Simone. I pushed the door open and stepped into my sanctuary. The expansive chambers featured a massive mahogany desk positioned before floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The state seal hung proudly on the wall. I placed my leather briefcase onto the polished wood, took off my coat, and sat down in the high-backed leather chair. I took a deep breath, letting the absolute stillness wash over me. In my old life, I would have been frantic. I would have been crying in a cramped cubicle, trying to call Derek, begging him to listen while Kendra destroyed my reputation online. But that woman was dead. The woman sitting behind this desk did not negotiate with terrorists, and she did not care about country club gossip. I did not deal in rumors. I dealt in receipts. I opened my briefcase and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I booted it up to access a secure server. My first order of business was to secure the undeniable truth of what happened in my kitchen last night. Derek and his family were so blinded by arrogance, they forgot about the small camera tucked inside the smoke detector. We installed it 2 years ago when we adopted a rescue dog. Derek bought it, but I set up the cloud storage account. He had clearly forgotten it even existed. I logged into the security portal. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I navigated to the time-stamped recordings from the previous evening. I clicked on the file labeled Tuesday 8 p.m. The high-definition video loaded instantly onto my screen. The audio was crystal clear. I watched as Terrence slammed the fake quitclaim deed onto the marble counter. I listened to his threats of wage garnishment. I watched myself tear the document in half and feed it into the shredder. And then the main event. I watched in vivid color as Vivian picked up the heavy crystal vase and smashed it against the floor. I watched her drop to her knees and violently scratch her own face and arms. I watched Terrence pull out his phone and manufacture a frantic 911 call while Derek rushed into the room, blindly accepting their fabricated reality. It was a flawless documentation of perjury, filing a false police report, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I downloaded the raw video file and saved it to 3 separate encrypted drives. Let Vivian show her scratch face to the ladies at the country club. I was going to show this video to the district attorney. But the assault charade was just a distraction. The real crime, the vulnerability that would completely dismantle them, was buried in their finances. I picked up the heavy desk phone and pressed a button connecting me directly to my senior clerk, a sharp young lawyer named Marcus. "Marcus," I said when he answered, "I need you in my chambers immediately. Bring the federal subpoena templates and clear your morning schedule." Within 60 seconds, Marcus was standing in front of my desk, a legal pad in hand. "We are initiating an emergency financial review," I told him, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. It contained the names of Terrence's known limited liability companies, Vivian's personal bank routing numbers, and the corporate tax identification number for Derek's car dealership. "I need emergency subpoenas issued to every financial institution associated with these entities. I want 10 years of bank statements, tax returns, wire transfer logs, and property deeds. I want it all expedited under the authority of an ongoing federal fraud investigation." Marcus looked at the names on the list. He was a professional, but I saw the slight widening of his eyes as he recognized my husband's name. He did not ask questions, he simply nodded. "I will have the orders drafted and routed to the Federal Cyber Crimes Division within the hour, Your Honor." I knew that as a newly appointed judge I possessed the authority to compel the immediate release of these documents, but I also had powerful allies. During my decade as a public defender, I had worked closely with a brilliant forensic accountant at the Federal Bureau of Investigation named Sarah. We had collaborated on several massive white-collar crime cases, taking down corrupt politicians and corporate executives. I picked up my cell phone and dialed her direct line. Sarah answered on the first ring. "Simone," she said warmly. "Or should I say, Your Honor, word travels fast." I smiled. "Word does travel fast, Sarah. I need a favor, a big one. I am sending over a batch of emergency subpoenas regarding a suspected real estate fraud and potential money laundering operation right here in Atlanta. The primary target is a real estate broker named Terrence. I need your team to bypass the bureaucratic red tape and pull his offshore and domestic accounts immediately." Sarah did not hesitate. "Send the routing numbers over the secure encrypted channel. If he is moving dirty money, my team will find the digital footprints by lunchtime. Consider it a congratulations gift on your appointment." I thanked her and hung up the phone. The gears of the federal justice system were now turning, locking onto Terrence and his fragile house of cards. I leaned back in my leather chair and turned my attention to the stack of pending cases on my desk. I spent the next 3 hours performing my official judicial duties, reviewing motions, signing warrants, and reading legal briefs. The quiet routine of the law grounded me. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic warfare my in-laws were currently waging on social media. My dead cell phone sat silently in my briefcase, completely cut off from their toxic vitriol. I did not need to see what lies Kendra was spinning. I did not need to hear Derek's pathetic demands. I only needed to wait for the math to arrive. Numbers never lied. Numbers never cried victim. Numbers simply revealed the cold, hard truth. At exactly 12:15 in the afternoon, there was a sharp knock on my heavy oak door. Marcus walked in carrying a thick, sealed manila envelope bearing the official red stamp of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. He placed it carefully on the center of my mahogany desk. "The expedited records from Agent Sarah," he said quietly. "They flagged several anomalies right away." I thanked Marcus and dismissed him, waiting until the heavy door clicked shut before I reached for the envelope. I picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the thick paper. I pulled out a stack of heavily redacted bank statements, wire transfer logs, and corporate ownership documents. I spread them out across the smooth surface of my desk, grabbing a red pen and a yellow highlighter. I was hunting for the specific money trail connected to the fake quitclaim deed Terrence had tried to force me to sign. I expected to find evidence of his disastrous cryptocurrency losses. I expected to find loans from unregulated, dangerous lenders. I expected to see the desperate finances of a man trying to save himself from violent loan sharks by stealing my house. I found all of that. Terrence was indeed millions of dollars in debt to a syndicate of shadow lenders. But as I traced the flow of cash following the highlighted routing numbers from his failing shell companies, my red pen suddenly stopped moving. I stared at a specific sequence of wire transfers. I blinked, my mind rapidly processing the catastrophic implications of the numbers printed on the page. The money Terrence was borrowing from these dangerous lenders was not just disappearing into bad crypto investments. It was being systematically routed through a secondary corporate entity to wash the funds clean. I traced the tax identification number of that secondary entity. It led directly to the primary operating account of Derek's mid-sized car dealership. I flipped to the next page, my heart turning to solid ice. There were dozens of transactions. Fictitious car sales, wildly inflated inventory purchases, and massive consulting fees paid to phantom companies. Terrence was not just a desperate man trying to steal a house. He was running a sophisticated money laundering operation, and he was using my husband's business to do it. And right there on the bottom of the fraudulent loan approvals and fake inventory manifests was Derek's unmistakable signature. The bank records had arrived, and I had found something far worse than a fake deed. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, the silence of my judicial chambers pressing in around me. For 10 years, I had believed that my marriage, while emotionally unfulfilling, was at least built on a foundation of basic legality. I had accepted Derek's flaws. I had accepted his cowardice when it came to his family. I had even accepted his lack of ambition, quietly paying off his mother's debts to protect his fragile pride. But looking at these signatures, I realized with horrifying clarity that my marriage was not just a personal failure. It was a catastrophic criminal liability. As a newly appointed federal judge, my reputation and my background were subjected to the highest levels of scrutiny. If the Federal Bureau of Investigation discovered this money laundering ring before I did, the consequences would be apocalyptic. Derek would be indicted, arrested, and paraded in front of the media. The ensuing scandal would instantly destroy my judicial career before it had even truly begun. They would question how a brilliant legal mind could be married to a man running a criminal enterprise right under her nose. They would assume I was complicit. Derek's desperation for his family's approval had placed a loaded gun directly to the head of my entire life's work. I stared at his signature, feeling a profound sense of disgust. He had told me I did not understand big business. He had mocked my government salary and called me a low-level desk jockey. Yet he was blindly signing federal tax documents that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 to 20 years in federal prison. Terrence was using Derek as the ultimate fall guy. When the scheme inevitably collapsed and the feds came knocking, Terrence would disappear. Derek would be the one holding the forged documents and the empty bank accounts. Derek was walking straight into a federal penitentiary, entirely convinced he was building a real estate empire. The tragedy of his stupidity was overwhelming, but I did not have the luxury of feeling pity. Pity was an emotion for people who were not currently in the crosshairs of a federal investigation. I had to act immediately to sever myself from this toxic radioactive family. I needed to build an ironclad legal firewall between my assets, my career, and Derek's criminal enterprise. The house was already secured under my blind limited liability company. Now I needed to file the divorce papers with a specific legal maneuver that explicitly insulated me from any of his corporate liabilities. I had to officially report his crimes to the prosecutor before the audit algorithms caught him. I began drafting the legal framework right there at my desk. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of a surgeon operating on a malignant tumor. I was cutting Derek out of my life piece by piece. I was ensuring that when the federal hammer finally fell, I would not even feel the wind of its descent. I documented every fraudulent transaction, cross-referencing the dates and the amounts with the surveillance footage from my kitchen. I was building a prosecution file so flawless, so comprehensive, that the district attorney would only have to sign their name at the bottom to secure a conviction. For the next few hours, the only sound in the room was the rapid clicking of my keyboard and the occasional turning of a page. I was completely absorbed in the meticulous destruction of my in-laws' false reality. They thought they had expelled me from their family. They did not realize I was systematically dismantling the very foundation of their existence. Every keystroke was a silent declaration of war, a methodical retaliation against years of emotional abuse, financial extortion, and profound disrespect. I was no longer the quiet wife sitting at the end of the dining table. I was the architect of their absolute ruin. Just as I finished encrypting the final batch of evidence into a secure digital dossier, a sharp knock echoed through the heavy oak door of my chambers. I paused, my hands hovering over the keyboard. "Enter." I called out, my voice steady and commanding. The door opened, and Marcus stepped into the room. His expression was unusually tense, his professional demeanor masking a hint of genuine concern. He was holding a thick, legal-sized envelope made of stiff cardboard. It did not bear the seal of the federal government or the internal routing stamp of the courthouse. It looked entirely out of place in this environment. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor," Marcus said, stepping forward and placing the envelope carefully on the edge of my desk. "A private courier just delivered this to the security checkpoint downstairs. They insisted it was highly sensitive personal legal correspondence. The guard screened it for safety and sent it straight up." I looked at the envelope. There was no return address, only my name printed in bold, aggressive black letters. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, reaching for my silver letter opener. "You may return to your desk. Let me know if the prosecutor calls regarding the financial files I submitted earlier this morning." Marcus nodded respectfully and left the chambers, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. I picked up the envelope, weighing it in my hands. It was thick, containing at least 20 pages of legal documents. I slid the blade of the letter opener under the flap and sliced it open. I pulled the documents out and flattened them against the mahogany surface of my desk. The header on the first page was printed in large, uncompromising font. "In the Superior Court of the County. Order of protection and notice of civil lawsuit." I let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that echoed off the high ceiling of my office. It was a temporary restraining order. Vivian had actually gone through with it. She had taken her scratched face, her manufactured tears, and her ridiculous lies straight to a local magistrate to officially declare me a violent threat. I flipped to the second page, reading the accompanying civil complaint. The audacity was staggering. Vivian was officially suing me for $50,000 in damages for emotional distress, medical evaluation costs, and property damage resulting from the alleged destruction of her crystal vase. But the legal maneuvering did not stop there. Attached to the civil suit was an emergency financial injunction. Terrence's overpriced lawyer had filed a motion requesting the court to immediately freeze my personal bank accounts, claiming I was a flight risk who might attempt to conceal marital assets before the divorce proceedings could commence. They were trying to cut off my access to my own money, believing that starving me financially would force me to sign their fraudulent quitclaim deed in exchange for a settlement. They thought they had trapped me. They thought this piece of paper delivered the final, crushing blow. I looked at the restraining order, then shifted my gaze to the stack of federal money laundering evidence sitting right next to it. The courier had just delivered the perfect invitation. Vivian officially wanted to meet me in court. I neatly stacked the pages of the temporary restraining order next to the federal money laundering evidence. Vivian wanted a legal battle. She believed filing a civil lawsuit would intimidate me into submission. She envisioned I would cower before a magistrate, terrified of a false charge and desperate to protect my savings. She was playing checkers while I orchestrated a federal raid. I dialed the chief prosecutor's direct extension. David answered immediately. I informed him about the civil suit and the financial injunction Vivian had filed against me. David let out a low whistle, fully aware of the gathered evidence. He asked if his office should intervene and quash the civil proceedings. I told him no. I wanted them to walk into the courthouse completely unaware. I wanted the trap to snap shut in a public forum. David agreed. He promised to be present in the courtroom tomorrow as the hammer of the state. The rest of the afternoon passed in hyper-focused productivity. I finalized the divorce petition, structuring it to sever my financial liability from Derek's impending criminal convictions. I included an airtight asset protection clause based on the proof of his fraudulent activities. At 6, I locked my chambers and took the private elevator down to the secure garage. I drove back to the upscale hotel, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Atlanta was built on appearances, and my in-laws were starring in their own manufactured reality show. I ordered room service, enjoying a quiet meal while looking over the financial ledgers. I felt no dread about facing them in court. The anxiety belonged entirely to the guilty, even if they were too arrogant to realize it. At exactly 9 in the evening, my burner phone buzzed on the nightstand. I had purchased a temporary prepaid phone to bypass the flood of social media notifications, but I texted Derek the new number purely for logistical purposes regarding the divorce. I picked up the phone. A text message from Derek illuminated the screen. It was a long paragraph dripping with condescending pity. I read the words, marveling at the depth of his delusion. "Simone," he wrote, "I am trying to do you a favor here. Mom is furious, and her face is in terrible shape. But she is willing to drop the assault charges and cancel the hearing tomorrow. All you have to do is sign the property away and agree to an uncontested divorce with zero alimony. Terrence has prepared the settlement documents. Do not fight this. Terrence hired a $600 an hour shark. You cannot afford this. You cannot win. Just take the deal and walk away before you end up in jail." I read the message a second time. The audacity was breathtaking. Derek genuinely believed he was throwing me a lifeline. He thought he was playing the benevolent savior, offering the abusive wife a chance to escape prison by simply handing over her life savings and walking away destitute. He mentioned the $600 an hour lawyer, as if that figure alone would terrify me into signing a fraudulent document. In his mind, justice was something you purchased. He believed whoever had the most expensive attorney automatically won the argument. He did not understand that a lawyer, no matter how expensive, was merely a guest in the courtroom. The judge owned the house. I knew exactly the type of attorney Terrence would hire. Atlanta was full of flashy defense attorneys who bought expensive billboards and wore custom suits. They specialized in intimidating unrepresented opponents and burying the opposing counsel in frivolous paperwork. They thrived on fear. Terrence probably promised this lawyer a massive bonus once the family estate was sold and the laundered money cleared. This high-priced shark was currently sitting in a plush office somewhere, reviewing a fake quitclaim deed and a fabricated assault claim, completely unaware his clients were using him as a shield in a massive federal felony. Tomorrow morning, that lawyer would walk into the courthouse expecting to bully a broke public defender. Instead, he was going to find himself standing before a federal judge holding indisputable forensic evidence. I looked at the burner phone in my hand. I thought about the 10 years I had spent supporting Derek. I thought about the nights I stayed up helping him balance the books for his dealership, completely unaware that years later he would use those same books to launder illicit cash. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had quietly funneled into the family estate to save his mother from foreclosure. I had offered them nothing but loyalty, financial stability, and silent protection. In return, they had treated me like a servant, and now they were trying to frame me for assault and steal my property to cover their own criminal debts. Derek was telling me I could not afford to fight them. He had no idea that I was not fighting them. I was simply executing them under the full authority of the law. I stood up from the small desk in the hotel room and walked over to the closet. I unzipped the garment bag containing the outfit I would wear to court tomorrow. It was a tailored charcoal gray suit. It was unassuming, professional, and entirely appropriate for a defendant appearing at a civil restraining order hearing. I wanted to maintain the illusion until the very last possible second. I wanted Vivian to walk into that courtroom feeling like a queen. I wanted Terrence to swagger in like he owned the building. I wanted Derek to look at me with that pathetic, misplaced pity. The higher they climbed on their pedestal of arrogance, the more devastating the fall would be when I finally pulled the lever. My burner phone buzzed again. Another message from Derek. "Please, Simone, I do not want to see you in handcuffs. Mom has the police report. She has photos of her face. You have no evidence. You have no money. Do the right thing. Call me back and tell me you will sign the papers. The sheer arrogance blinded them to the reality of the battlefield they had just stepped onto. They were marching into an arena wearing paper armor, convinced they were invincible because they had convinced themselves of their own lies. They thought they controlled the narrative because Kendra had successfully manipulated a few dozen country club wives on the internet. But social media likes did not hold up under cross-examination. Fabricated tears did not negate subpoenaed bank statements. And a $600 an hour lawyer could not save a man from the irrefutable proof of his own forged signature on federal tax documents. Tomorrow was supposed to be a preliminary hearing for the temporary restraining order. Normally, this would be a brief affair in a small county courtroom. The magistrate would listen to Vivian's dramatic testimony, look at the photos of her scratched face, and likely grant the order based on an abundance of caution. Terrence's lawyer would then use that order as leverage in the divorce proceedings, demanding I surrender the house to avoid a permanent criminal record. It was a standard dirty tactic used by desperate people. But I had already spoken with the scheduling clerk. Given the complex financial injunctions Terrence's lawyer had foolishly attached to the restraining order, I had the hearing transferred to a larger courtroom, a courtroom equipped to handle extensive evidentiary submissions. I had also ensured that the security detail was fully briefed. When Terrence walked into that room, he would not be walking out. I sat down on the edge of the large hotel bed. The city outside my window was quiet now, settling into the darkness of the early morning hours. I felt a profound stillness in my mind. For years I had navigated the treacherous waters of my husband's family, constantly shrinking myself to avoid upsetting their fragile egos. I had swallowed insults, paid their debts, and endured their condescension. I had done it all in the name of keeping the peace, but there was no peace left to keep. There was only the cold, sterile reality of the law. I picked up the burner phone one last time. I opened the text thread with Derek. I did not write a long paragraph explaining my position. I did not try to convince him of his mother's lies. I did not warn him about the federal indictments hanging over his head. I did not mention the subpoenaed bank records or the hidden camera footage. I simply typed my final response. I do not need a lawyer. The morning of the hearing arrived with a crisp, clear sky that belied the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. I parked in my secure underground space and took the private elevator up to my chambers one last time to retrieve the encrypted flash drive containing the compiled evidence. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my tailored black suit. I looked at my reflection in the mirror hanging on the back of my office door. I did not look like a woman facing a devastating civil lawsuit. I looked like the executioner. I took a steadying breath, walked out of my chambers, and navigated the private back hallways until I reached the public corridors. I blended into the morning crowd of clerks and paralegals, making my way down to the sprawling marble lobby where they would be waiting. The lobby was a cavernous space echoing with the hum of 100 different legal battles. I stood near a massive stone pillar observing the main entrance. At exactly 8:45, the heavy glass doors swung open and my soon-to-be ex-family made their grand entrance. They did not walk into the building like people attending a serious legal proceeding. They arrived as if they were stepping onto a red carpet at a high society gala. Vivian led the pack. She was wearing a dramatic, wide-brimmed black hat and a structured emerald green dress that screamed desperate wealth. She had strategically applied her makeup to ensure the scratches on her face were highly visible, yet perfectly framed. She was playing the role of the elegant, tragic victim to absolute perfection. Flanking her was Kendra, who was actually holding her phone up recording a video for her social media followers right there in the courthouse lobby. I could practically hear her whispering updates to her country club audience about the brave stand her family was taking. Terrence strutted a few steps behind them, wearing a flashy, double-breasted navy suit that was entirely too tight. He wore a smug grin, looking around the lobby as if he were shopping for his next real estate acquisition, completely oblivious to the fact that federal agents were currently dissecting his entire life. Derek walked beside Terrence. My husband looked slightly pale, his eyes darting nervously around the crowd, but he kept his chin jutted out in a pathetic imitation of confidence. And finally, leading them all toward the security checkpoint was their $600 an hour shark. The lawyer wore a custom pinstripe suit, a silk tie, and an expression of supreme bored arrogance. He carried a pristine leather briefcase and checked his gold watch with a theatrical sigh, clearly annoyed that he had to waste his morning on such a trivial domestic dispute. I stepped out from behind the stone pillar and walked directly into their path. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting at my sides watching them approach. Kendra was the first to spot me. She lowered her phone, her perfectly glossed lips twisting into a nasty sneer. She tapped Vivian on the shoulder. Vivian stopped dead in her tracks, her dramatic hat tilting as she locked eyes with me. The entire entourage came to a halt. For a moment, the bustling noise of the courthouse lobby seemed to fade into the background. Vivian looked me up and down, taking in my sharp, understated black suit and the absence of any legal representation by my side. A cruel, triumphant smile broke across her scratched face. Her voice rang out, loud enough for the passing attorneys and security guards to hear. "Look at her," Vivian mocked, gesturing toward me with a manicured hand. "Look at this pathetic display. Not even a public defender would take her case. You actually showed up here by yourself. I thought you would at least have the sense to hire one of those cheap strip mall lawyers." Terrence burst into a loud, obnoxious laugh. He shook his head, looking at me with absolute disdain. "I told you she was delusional," Terrence said, turning to his lawyer. "She really thinks she can walk in here and talk her way out of a restraining order." Derek refused to meet my eyes. He stared firmly at the marble floor, shifting his weight from foot to foot. The expensive attorney stepped forward, sizing me up with the predatory gaze of a man who made his living bullying the defenseless. He offered a tight, artificial smile. "You must be Simone," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "I am Mr. Sterling, managing partner at Sterling and Hayes. I represent Vivian in this matter. Before we go into that courtroom and make things incredibly unpleasant for you on the public record, I strongly advise you to reconsider my client's settlement offer. If you sign the quitclaim deed relinquishing your marital rights to the property, we will withdraw the petition for the restraining order today. You can walk out of this building without a permanent civil judgment on your record. It is a generous offer considering the physical damage you inflicted upon my client." I looked at Mr. Sterling. I saw a man who had absolutely no idea he was standing on a landmine. I did not raise my voice. I did not show any emotion. I simply looked him directly in the eyes. "There will be no settlement, Mr. Sterling," I replied evenly. "I suggest you save your breath for the judge, Mr." Sterling let out a harsh, dismissive chuckle. "Have it your way," he said, turning his back to me. "Let us proceed, Vivian. The bailiff is waiting." They swept past me in a cloud of heavy perfume and unearned arrogance. Kendra deliberately bumped her shoulder against mine as she walked by, whispering the word "loser" under her breath. I did not react. I simply turned and followed them down the long, polished corridor toward courtroom 4B. The tension in the air was palpable, heavy with their anticipation of my impending destruction. We reached the heavy double doors of the courtroom. The bailiff, a stern-looking officer I had known for 5 years, stepped out into the hallway. "All parties for the matter of Vivian versus Simone, please enter courtroom 4B, the bailiff announced loudly. The in-laws swaggered through the doors, entirely confident in their victory. I followed them inside, the heavy doors closing with a definitive thud behind me. The courtroom was an imposing space, featuring high vaulted ceilings, dark wood paneling, and a massive raised bench where the judge would sit. It was designed to make the average citizen feel small and insignificant. It was designed to project absolute authority. Vivian, Terrence, Kendra, and Derek marched confidently up the center aisle. They moved directly to the plaintiff's table on the right side of the room. Mr. Sterling placed his leather briefcase onto the polished table, popping the golden clasps with a sharp click. Vivian sat down in the heavy wooden chair, arranging her green dress and adjusting her posture to look as dignified and victimized as possible. Terrence sat next to her, leaning back and crossing his arms, a smirk permanently glued to his face. Kendra and Derek took their seats in the first row of the gallery section directly behind the plaintiff's table, ready to watch the show. I stood at the back of the courtroom taking in the scene. The trap was perfectly set. They had placed themselves exactly where I wanted them. They were sitting at the plaintiff's table waiting for a county magistrate to walk through the doors and hand them the keys to my life. They were entirely focused on the empty space at the defendant's table on the left side of the room. They expected me to walk over there, pull out a chair and sit down in trembling defeat. They expected me to wait quietly while their expensive lawyer finalized their fraudulent scheme. Mr. Sterling looked over his shoulder, noticing that I was still standing near the back doors. He gestured impatiently toward the empty defendant's table. "Take your seat, Simone," he ordered, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. "The judge will be here any minute, and they do not look kindly upon defendants who fail to show proper decorum." Vivian turned around in her chair, a look of pure malice in her eyes. "Sit down and accept your punishment," she hissed. I did not say a word. I did not sit at the defendant's table. I adjusted the lapels of my black suit, felt the weight of the encrypted flash drive in my pocket, and began to walk forward. I bypassed the defendant's table entirely. I walked past the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the officers of the court. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, my heels clicking against the polished wood floor. I did not stop walking for a single second. I bypassed the tables, bypassed the court reporter's desk, and walked directly toward the very front of the room. I stepped past the heavy oak railing that separated the gallery from the well of the court. This was the sacred boundary, a line no unrepresented defendant was ever supposed to cross without explicit permission from the presiding judge. I did not ask for permission. I walked up the 3 carpeted steps that led directly to the elevated platform of the judge's bench. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom behind me. Kendra stopped recording her social media video, her phone slipping slightly in her manicured hand. Vivian leaned forward in her heavy wooden chair, her eyes widening in a mixture of profound confusion and rising anger. Derek shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was deeply wrong, but lacking the intelligence to understand what it was. Mr. Sterling, the $600 an hour shark, immediately leaped to his feet. His chair scraped violently against the polished wood floor. He slammed his hand flat onto the plaintiff's table, his face flushing with professional indignation. "What on earth do you think you are doing?" Mr. Sterling barked, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. "You cannot go up there. Bailiff, stop this woman immediately. She is completely out of order. She is a violent defendant, and she is approaching the bench. Restrain her right now before I have you cited." I did not stop walking. I reached the massive mahogany bench and turned around, looking down at Mr. Sterling from the elevated position of absolute authority. I rested my hands flat on the polished wood. The bailiff Marcus, whom I had spoken with earlier that morning, did not rush forward to tackle me. He did not unclip his handcuffs or reach for his weapon. Instead, Marcus simply turned toward Mr. Sterling, crossed his arms over his broad chest, and offered the expensive lawyer a look of sheer, unadulterated pity. Marcus knew exactly who I was. He had guarded my chambers just a few hours ago. He stood his ground, a silent sentinel, protecting the true hierarchy of the courtroom. Mr. Sterling looked at the bailiff, his aggressive posture faltering for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowed. He was a seasoned attorney, a man who understood the unspoken language of the justice system. The bailiff's refusal to act was a massive, glaring anomaly. It was a glitch in the matrix of his manufactured reality. Vivian, however, possessed no such situational awareness. She stood up, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Have her arrested!" Vivian shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. "She is crazy! I told you she was mentally unstable. Look at her. She thinks she owns the place. Throw her in jail." Terrence joined in slapping the table. "This is ridiculous. She is making a mockery of the court. We demand that she be taken into custody immediately. She is a flight risk and a danger to my family." I looked down at them, feeling a profound sense of calm. The room was descending into chaos, but it was a chaos I completely controlled. I waited. I did not need to shout them down. I did not need to explain myself. I only needed to wait for the final piece of the trap to slide perfectly into place. I let their panic rise, watching them flail in the web they had spun for themselves. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden door located directly behind the judge's bench swung open. The courtroom instantly fell dead silent. Everyone expected the county magistrate to walk through that door wearing black robes and ready to dispense swift justice against the unruly defendant. But the person who stepped into the courtroom was not a low-level county magistrate. It was David. He was 45 years old, impeccably dressed, in a sharp navy suit, and he carried a massive stack of thick manila folders. David was the chief prosecutor for the entire district. He was a man feared by defense attorneys and respected by federal agents. He was the absolute embodiment of the state's legal hammer. David walked briskly into the room, his eyes scanning the space. He saw Mr. Sterling standing at the plaintiff's table, his face flushed red. He saw Vivian and Terrence looking incredibly smug, waiting for the execution to begin. And then David turned his head and looked up at the bench. He saw me standing there wearing my tailored black suit, my hands resting on the mahogany surface. David stopped dead in his tracks. His entire demeanor changed in a microsecond. The casual confidence of a prosecutor entering a standard hearing vanished, replaced by the rigid formal respect demanded by the highest levels of the judicial branch. He snapped his heels together, straightened his posture, and clutched the files tightly against his chest. He looked directly at me, his voice booming clearly across the silent courtroom. "Good morning, Your Honor," David said respectfully. Time stopped. The rotation of the earth seemed to halt entirely within the four walls of courtroom 4B. The silence that followed David's greeting was not just quiet. It was a suffocating, crushing vacuum that sucked the oxygen straight out of the lungs of my in-laws. "Your Honor." The words hung in the air, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings, refusing to dissipate. Vivian froze perfectly still, her hand still raised mid-point, her finger pointing at the space I occupied. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. The smug, triumphant expression melted off her face, replaced by a mask of absolute, unadulterated terror. Terrence sank slowly back into his chair, his eyes darting frantically between David and me. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He grabbed the edge of the plaintiff's table, his knuckles turning white. "What in the world?" "Who is she?" Terrence stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whisper. "What is he talking about?" But the most beautiful, devastating reaction belonged to Mr. Sterling, the $600 an hour shark. The man who had confidently threatened me in the lobby looked as though he had just been struck by a bolt of lightning. He recognized David instantly. Every lawyer in Atlanta knew the chief prosecutor, and when the chief prosecutor addressed a woman as Your Honor, there was only one possible explanation. Mr. Sterling's eyes locked onto me wide with sheer, unmitigated horror. He suddenly recognized my face from the recent state judicial appointment announcements. He recognized the sharp black suit, the unyielding posture, and the absolute lack of fear I had displayed in the lobby. He was not standing opposite a broke public defender. He was standing opposite a newly appointed federal district judge. Mr. Sterling realized in one horrifying instant that he had been dragged into a suicide mission. His clients had hired him to file a fraudulent civil suit against a sitting federal judge. They had instructed him to submit a fake quitclaim deed into evidence. They had actively lied to him about my identity, my financial status, and the events of the previous night. He was standing in a courtroom, officially representing people who were committing felony perjury and attempting to extort a high-ranking judicial officer. His prestigious career, his lucrative law firm, and his immaculate reputation were currently dangling over a massive blazing fire. Mr. Sterling slowly lowered himself into his chair. He did not look at Vivian. He did not look at Terrence. He stared blankly straight ahead, his chest heaving as he tried to process the catastrophic reality of his situation. He looked like a man who had just discovered the parachute he strapped on was entirely empty. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, frantic calculation of how many years he might spend in prison for conspiring with criminals. In the gallery, Kendra let out a small, strangled gasp. Her phone slipped completely from her grasp, clattering loudly onto the wooden bench. Derek buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, pathetic moan of pure despair. My husband finally understood why I had been so calm. He finally understood why I had shredded the deed and walked out into the rain without shedding a single tear. I was not a victim. I was the apex predator, and they had willingly walked directly into my den without checking the locks. I looked at the four of them, taking in their utter devastation. This was the payoff. This was the precise moment the pressure cooker exploded, obliterating their toxic hierarchy forever. They had spent 10 years treating me like a second-class citizen and ungrateful charity case who was lucky to be associated with their prestigious family. They had weaponized their wealth, their social standing, and their arrogance to keep me in my place. But their place was a house of cards built on fraud and delusion. My place was the bench. And from this bench I commanded an authority they could never buy. I turned my attention back to David. The chief prosecutor was standing patiently waiting for my instruction. He knew exactly what was happening. He had reviewed the subpoenaed bank statements I sent him. He knew about the money laundering, the fake car sales, and the unregulated loans. He knew that the people sitting at the plaintiff's table were not victims of domestic assault. They were the primary targets of a massive federal indictment. I allowed a slow, cold smile to spread across my face. It was the first time I had truly smiled since Vivian handed me that ridiculous property tax bill on Sunday evening. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored black suit. My fingers wrapped around the small, heavy metal casing of the encrypted flash drive. It contained the high-definition surveillance video of Vivian smashing her own crystal vase and scratching her own face. It contained the fraudulent quitclaim deed Terrence had tried to force me to sign. It contained the 10 years of subpoenaed bank records, the wire transfer logs, and the forged inventory manifests bearing my husband's signature. It contained the absolute destruction of their entire existence, wrapped securely in digital formatting. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket. I held it up for a brief second, allowing the fluorescent lights of the courtroom to catch the silver metal. Vivian stared at the small device, her eyes wide with mounting panic. She did not know exactly what was on it, but the primal fear in her expression confirmed she knew it was the weapon that would finally end her reign of terror. I extended my hand down toward David. The chief prosecutor stepped forward, reaching out to accept the drive. Our fingers brushed briefly as the transfer of power was officially completed. The evidence was now firmly in the hands of the state. David Fee have a report of felony fraud and perjury to make. David took the small silver drive from my hand with a solemn nod. He turned to the court clerk, a seasoned woman named Helen, who had worked in the district for over 2 decades. Helen, David said, his voice carrying the heavy weight of official business. Please connect this drive to the courtroom projector. We have evidence to enter into the record immediately. Helen took the drive and plugged it into the terminal on her desk. The large projection screen that dominated the wall behind the witness stand hummed to life. Until this exact moment, Vivian had been clinging to a desperate shred of hope that this was all an elaborate bluff. She thought that perhaps I was just trying to scare them with an empty threat. But as the bright blue light of the projector illuminated the room, the last remaining color drained entirely from her face. She sank lower into her heavy wooden chair, her manicured hands trembling violently on the polished surface of the plaintiff table. Mr. Sterling was sweating profusely. He frantically opened his pristine leather briefcase and began aggressively shuffling his papers, trying to figure out how to extricate himself from the impending disaster. "Your Honor," he sputtered, looking up at me with wide, panicked eyes. "I was not made aware of any digital evidence. My clients assured me that the events of Tuesday evening were purely a domestic disturbance resulting in physical harm to the plaintiff." I did not answer him. I kept my gaze fixed on the large projection screen. The video file loaded. It was the high-definition footage from the hidden camera situated inside the smoke detector of my kitchen. The image was crystal clear, capturing the entire width of the room. The audio was flawless. The courtroom was dead silent as the video began to play. There was Terrence strutting across my kitchen in his tight navy suit, slapping the fraudulent quitclaim deed onto the marble island. His arrogant voice echoed through the courtroom speakers, demanding that I relinquish my marital rights and threatening to garnish my wages. The gallery, which was usually empty during these routine civil hearings, was dotted with a few court clerks and off-duty officers who had caught wind of the drama. They watched in absolute fascination as my sister-in-law's husband proudly documented his own attempt at extortion. Then the footage showed me tearing the document in half and feeding it into the paper shredder. Terrence gasped on the video. And then came the moment that would define Vivian's legacy in Atlanta society forever. On the massive screen, Vivian marched over to the dining table. The high-definition camera captured every single nuance of her unhinged rage. She picked up the heavy crystal vase. The courtroom speakers crackled with the loud, violent sound of shattering glass as she hurled it onto the hardwood floor. Derek flinched in the gallery, watching the reality of his mother's deception play out in undeniable clarity. But the video continued. It showed Vivian dropping to her knees right in the middle of the broken glass. It showed her raising her hands to her face. The entire courtroom watched in collective horror and morbid fascination as Vivian dug her manicured fingernails into her own cheeks. With a vicious, calculated swipe, she dragged her nails across her skin, leaving the exact same bleeding scratches that were currently on display in the courtroom. She tore at the collar of her silk blouse. She violently scratched her own arms until red welts appeared. And then she opened her mouth and let out that piercing, blood-curdling shriek for help, falsely claiming that I had attacked her. The video showed Terrence pulling out his phone and dialing the police, eagerly manufacturing a frantic emergency call. It showed Derek rushing into the room, blindly accepting their fabricated reality without asking me a single question and screaming at me to get out of my own house. Helen paused the video exactly on the frame of Vivian's face, her fingers digging into her own flesh. The image remained frozen on the massive screen, a towering monument to her absolute deceit. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total destruction. The lie had not just been exposed, it had been broadcast in high definition to the chief prosecutor of the district. Mr. Sterling reacted first. The expensive attorney shot up from his chair as if the wood had suddenly caught fire. He did not care about his $600 an hour fee anymore. He did not care about the promised bonus from the real estate deal. He only cared about saving his license to practice law and avoiding a federal indictment for conspiracy. "Your Honor," Mr. Sterling practically shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He addressed me directly, recognizing the supreme authority I held in this building. "I formally request an immediate withdrawal as counsel of record for the plaintiff in this matter. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of this surveillance footage. I was retained under completely false pretenses. My clients deliberately provided me with fabricated information and explicitly lied about the origins of the physical injuries sustained by the plaintiff. I cannot, in good faith or in compliance with the ethical rules of the state bar, continue to represent individuals engaged in active perjury and the filing of false police reports." David stepped forward, his eyes fixed firmly on the terrified attorney. "Your withdrawal is noted for the record," Counselor David said coldly. "However, I strongly advise you to remain in the building. My office will require a comprehensive sworn statement regarding your retention and the specific communications you had with your former clients. You are now a material witness to a criminal conspiracy." Mr. Sterling swallowed hard, his chest heaving nervously. He quickly gathered his pristine leather briefcase, not bothering to organize his scattered papers. He snapped the golden clasp shut and stepped away from the plaintiff table, physically distancing himself from Vivian and Terrence, as if they were infected with a highly contagious disease. He walked quickly to the gallery and sat down in the very back row, keeping his head completely down. Vivian was left sitting alone at the table with Terrence. The elegant, tragic victim persona had completely evaporated. The emerald green dress now looked ridiculous, a cheap costume in a play that had just been violently canceled. She looked up at the frozen image of herself on the screen, and then she looked at me. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The reality of her situation was finally penetrating her thick armor of arrogance. She had walked into this courthouse intending to use the law as a weapon to steal my property. She had no idea that I was the one who controlled the armory. Terrence was shaking. The flashy real estate broker was gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked at David, his eyes wide with a desperate pleading fear. "Look," Terrence stammered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "This is all a huge misunderstanding. We were just upset. Emotions were running high. We can just drop the civil suit right now. We will withdraw the restraining order petition today. We can all just walk away and forget this ever happened. I am sorry. Vivian is sorry. We withdraw the case entirely." David looked at Terrence with a mixture of profound disgust and professional coldness. The chief prosecutor walked slowly toward the plaintiff table, resting his hands on the wooden railing that separated the well from the gallery. "You do not seem to understand the current nature of these proceedings," David said, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. "This is no longer a civil hearing for a temporary restraining order. You do not have the authority to simply withdraw and walk away. When you filed a sworn affidavit with this court claiming you were the victim of a violent assault, and when you submitted a police report containing fabricated allegations, you committed felony perjury. You attempted to use the judicial system to execute a fraudulent extortion scheme." David pointed a stern finger at the frozen image on the screen. "The state takes a remarkably harsh stance on individuals who manufacture evidence and waste the resources of law enforcement. The civil petition is entirely dead. This proceeding has officially transitioned into a preliminary criminal review. My office is taking direct jurisdiction over this matter immediately. You are no longer plaintiffs in a domestic dispute. You are the primary suspects in an active felony investigation." In the gallery, Derek let out a loud, wrenching sob. My husband had finally realized the absolute finality of his family's destruction. Kendra was sitting frozen next to him, her perfectly manicured hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer terror. The social media campaign was over. The country club gossip was irrelevant. The Atlanta elite circles they desperately clung to would scatter like roaches the second the federal indictments became public record. Vivian finally broke. The fake manufactured tears she had cried for the police and her country club friends were replaced by genuine, unadulterated terror. She slumped forward in her heavy wooden chair, burying her scratched face in her trembling hands. She began to weep loudly, her shoulders shaking with the profound realization that her legacy was completely destroyed. She was not going to be remembered as the elegant matriarch of an old money family. She was going to be remembered as a convicted felon who violently scratched her own face in a pathetic attempt to extort her daughter-in-law. I stood at the bench, looking down at the wreckage of my former family. A small, naive part of the woman I used to be might have felt a twinge of pity for them. But that woman had died the moment Derek told me to get out of my own house. The judge standing in her place felt nothing but the cold, sterile satisfaction of perfect justice. They thought they had backed a helpless desk worker into a corner. They thought they could bully me into surrendering everything I had worked for. But I was not finished. The assault charge and the perjury were just the appetizers in this legal slaughter. The main course was far more devastating, and it carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I watched Vivian crying her real tears. I watched Terrence trembling in his tight navy suit. I watched Derek sobbing in the gallery. I reached into my leather briefcase resting on the bench. I bypassed the civil codes and the procedural manuals. I reached deep inside and pulled out the thick stack of heavily redacted bank statements, the wire transfer logs, and the forged inventory manifests bearing my husband's signature. I held the thick stack of papers up, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of their financial execution. "The perjury charges will secure your immediate arrest," I said calmly, my voice cutting cleanly through Vivian's loud weeping. "But we are not here today just to discuss a broken crystal vase." I stepped down from the bench and walked slowly toward the chief prosecutor, handing the thick stack of federal financial documents directly to David. "Let us discuss the money laundering." The phrase money laundering hung in the air like a death sentence. Terrence flinched as if he had been physically struck. His smug demeanor, the slick confidence of an Atlanta real estate mogul, completely shattered. He looked at the thick stack of papers resting in the hands of David and knew his entire criminal empire was contained within those pages. David placed the documents on the plaintiff table right in front of Terrence. The chief prosecutor did not rush. He deliberately opened the first folder, revealing the catastrophic financial trail I had spent the entire morning compiling. Vivian stared blankly. Her tears momentarily stopped as a new profound confusion washed over her scratched face. She did not understand high-level financial crimes. She only understood that her son-in-law was suddenly hyperventilating. David pulled a specific document from the top of the stack and held it up for the courtroom to see. It was the quitclaim deed Terrence had slammed onto my kitchen island just 48 hours prior. I watched Terrence swallow hard as David pointed to the signatures on the page. This document, David announced, his voice projecting absolute authority, was submitted to my office early today. It purports to transfer the marital rights of a multi-million-dollar estate. However, a preliminary review by federal investigators confirms that this document is a complete forgery. The notary stamp is fabricated, the signatures are illegitimate, and the county codes cited are entirely fictitious. You attempted to force a sitting federal judge to sign a fraudulent legal document under the threat of extortion. Terrence shook his head frantically, his eyes wide with a desperate, animalistic terror. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, trying to physically push the truth away from him. "That was just a draft," Terrence stammered. His voice cracked into a high pitch. "It was just a preliminary proposal. I did not force her to sign anything. She tore it up. It is not a crime if the contract was never executed." David offered a cold, humorless smile. "Attempted extortion using a forged legal document is absolutely a felony, counselor. But the forged deed is simply the mechanism you use to try and save yourself from the real crisis. The deed was an act of desperation. We are far more interested in why you were so desperate for $25,000 on a Tuesday night." David turned to the next folder. He pulled out the heavily redacted bank statements and wire transfer logs. He spread them across the polished wood of the table, creating a mosaic of undeniable guilt. "You have been borrowing massive sums of cash from unregulated shadow lenders," David stated, his words hitting Terrence like physical blows. "You leveraged assets you did not own to secure high-interest loans from dangerous individuals. When the crypto market wiped out your portfolio, you panicked. You needed a way to introduce that dirty cash into the legitimate banking system so you could pay your creditors. Without triggering a federal audit, you needed a washing machine, and you found one right inside your own family." Vivian gasped, finally beginning to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the situation. She looked at Terrence, her eyes wide with horror. "What is he talking about?" Vivian demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "Terrence, what did you do?" Terrence did not answer her. He was staring at the floor, his chest heaving, his entire body shaking uncontrollably. He knew the trap had snapped completely shut. David did not wait for an answer. He pulled the final set of documents from the folder. These were the dealership inventory logs, the very foundation of the supposed business success of my husband. David held them up, making sure Derek had a clear view from the gallery. "According to these ledgers," David continued, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "the mid-sized car dealership owned by Derek has been experiencing a miraculous boom in luxury vehicle sales. Dozens of high-end sports cars and customized SUVs sold for pure cash to anonymous buyers. It is a highly profitable enterprise on paper. But when federal agents cross-referenced the identification numbers listed on these receipts with registries, they discovered a glaring anomaly. The cars do not exist. They are phantom vehicles. They were fabricated entirely to justify the sudden influx of massive cash deposits into the dealership accounts. You handed over the dirty money. Terrence and the dealership recorded it as legitimate revenue." The courtroom was dead silent, save for the sound of David turning the pages. Once the money was clean, David explained, "The dealership paid out exorbitant consulting fees to your real estate firm. The laundered cash was returned to you under the guise of legitimate business expenses. It is a textbook money laundering operation. It is sophisticated, it is brazen, and it carries a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary." Terence closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and rolling down his ashen cheek. He had played the high-stakes game of Atlanta real estate and lost everything. He was no longer a wealthy broker. He was a convicted felon waiting for a prison cell. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, definitive crash. The sound echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, causing everyone in the gallery to jump in panic. 4 men walked into the room. They were not local police officers or county sheriffs. They wore dark suits, serious expressions, and badges clipped to their belts. They were federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. They had been waiting in the hallway listening to David lay out the undeniable evidence. They marched down the center aisle, their footsteps heavy and synchronized. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from a legal proceeding to an active crime scene. The federal agents bypassed the wooden gate and approached the plaintiff table. The lead agent, a tall man with a stern face, stopped. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Terence," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Stand up and place your hands behind your back. You are under arrest for felony fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Terence did not argue. He did not fight. The sheer weight of the evidence had completely crushed his spirit. He slowly stood up from his heavy wooden chair, his legs shaking so violently he could barely support his own weight. He turned around instantly. He placed his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent courtroom was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of absolute justice. The agents flanked Terence on both sides, securing their grip on his arms. Vivian sat frozen at the table, her mouth hanging open, unable to process the reality of her son-in-law being hauled away in chains. She reached out a trembling hand as if she could somehow stop the federal government from taking him, but she said absolutely nothing to the arresting officers. Her fabricated assault claims were entirely forgotten, buried beneath the avalanche of a massive federal indictment. Then the silence was shattered by a piercing, hysterical scream. It came from the gallery. Kendra leaped from her seat, her perfectly manicured hands gripping her expensive blonde hair. "No," Kendra shrieked, her voice echoing wildly off the walls. "No, you cannot take him. He did not do anything. This is a mistake. Let him go." She rushed forward, slamming her hands against the wooden railing that separated the gallery from the well. The bailiff immediately stepped in front of her, raising his hand. "Ma'am, you need to step back and calm down immediately." Marcus warned, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Kendra ignored him. She looked at Terence, who was being marched toward the back doors by the federal agents. Terence did not look back at her. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, completely defeated. Kendra turned her frantic gaze toward me. Her face was contorted in absolute horror and pure, unadulterated rage. "You did this!" Kendra screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You ruined my life. You are a monster." I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. "Your life is ruined because you married a fraud, Kendra," I replied evenly. "You are no longer the golden child. You are the wife of a felon." The utter destruction of the toxic family hierarchy was absolute. I turned my gaze away from the sobbing mess of my sister-in-law and looked at the last remaining piece of the puzzle. Derek sat completely paralyzed in the gallery. He stared blankly at the federal agents escorting Terence out the heavy door. Derek now looks at Simone, trembling, realizing he has lost his wife, his business, and his freedom. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind me, muting the chaotic aftermath of the hearing. I stepped into the expansive marble hallway, the cool air a stark contrast to the suffocating tension inside. My leather briefcase felt light in my hand, unburdened of the heavy evidence that had just dismantled an empire of lies. I walked toward the bank of elevators with a steady, measured pace. I did not look back. But I did not have to. The frantic, echoing sound of heavy footsteps slapping against the polished stone floor told me someone was following closely. "Simone, wait! Please, you have to wait!" It was Derek. His voice was completely stripped of the arrogant condescension he had wielded just the night before. Now it was a high-pitched, desperate whine. I stopped and slowly turned around. Derek practically collapsed at my feet. He looked physically ill. The sharp suit he had worn to project power now hung loosely on his trembling frame. His eyes were red and swollen, brimming with tears of absolute panic. He looked back toward the courtroom doors, terrified that the federal agents might emerge at any second to take him away. He dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the public hallway. He did not care who saw him. Attorneys and court clerks walked past, casting curious glances at the pathetic display, but Derek was entirely focused on me. "Simone, I am so sorry," he sobbed, reaching out to grab the hem of my suit jacket. I pulled back sharply, stepping out of his reach. "Please, Simone, we are family. You are my wife. We can fix this. You know people in the federal system. You can talk to the prosecutor. You can make them understand." I was manipulated. Derek pleaded, clasping his hands together in a desperate prayer. "Terrence lied to me. My mother pressured me. I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to keep the peace. You have to save me from this. If the feds audit the dealership, they will seize everything. I will go to prison. We can start over. Just tell them I did not know what the documents were. We can be a real family now that Terrence is gone." I looked down at the man I had spent an entire decade of my life protecting. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, no lingering affection. He was a stranger begging for a lifeline he did not deserve. "You were not manipulated, Derek," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You signed those fraudulent loan approvals because you were greedy and weak. You allowed your family to abuse me because it was easier than standing up for your own wife. You stood in our kitchen yesterday and watched your mother manufacture a felony assault charge against me, and you ordered me out of my own home without a single second of hesitation. There is no we anymore." I continued my words, cutting through his frantic sobbing like a scalpel. "You made your choice when you told me to surrender my assets to grease the wheels of your illegal real estate deal." I reached into my leather briefcase one final time. I bypassed the judicial files and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I dropped it onto the marble floor right in front of his knees. He looked down at it, his tears splashing onto the paper. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely speak. "Those are your divorce papers," I explained with surgical precision. "They have been drafted to completely sever my financial liability from your impending criminal convictions. They include an airtight asset protection clause based on the undeniable proof of your fraudulent activities. You will sign them immediately. You will not contest a single clause. If you attempt to fight this divorce, I will ensure the federal prosecutor seeks the maximum possible sentence for your involvement in the money laundering ring. You are going to face the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation completely and utterly alone today." Derek stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He slowly looked up at me, the complete realization of his doom settling over his features. "But you are my wife," he choked out, grasping for a loyalty he had destroyed. "You chose your mother," I said, my voice echoing off the cold marble walls. "I chose justice." I turned my back on him. I did not wait for a response. I walked away, the sharp click of my heels ringing out with absolute finality. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut, severing my view of Derek sobbing on the floor. The descent was smooth and quiet. I walked out of the courthouse and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the bright morning sunlight. I took a deep breath. The air tasted sweet and incredibly clean. I walked down the sweeping concrete steps, feeling the oppressive weight of the past 10 years finally lifting from my shoulders. The narrative they had written for me was over. I had seized the pen and I had rewritten the ending with the undeniable absolute power of the truth. I realized true power is silent until the exact moment it is ready to strike. You absolutely do not need to scream to be heard in this world. You do not need to engage in petty social media wars to prove your incredible worth to people who never mattered. Blood does not make a family. Respect does. They thought I was a quiet desk worker they could bully, but they forgot that the person who handles the paperwork holds all the power. Have you ever let your success be your loudest revenge against a toxic family? Tell me your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life justice.